Yesterday, I had an opportunity to go to my first Pioneers game. And I will say that this community has really gotten into the baseball spirit. But if you followed the Pioneers last night, you know that there was a shellacking, 22-3. So I figured today, let me start out with a basketball illustration. Because I want to share with you a story about probably one of the greatest basketball players of all time. Who do we got here? Michael Jordan. Amazing basketball player. One time in a game, he scored 69 points. Imagine that, 69 points against professional athletes. Well, the day that he scored 69 points was also the NBA debut of an athlete by the name of Stacey King. Stacey King in that game shot a free throw, and he made it. And so after the game, Stacey King was being interviewed by a TV reporter and was talking about how Michael Jordan just scored 69 points for the other team, and he scored 1 point. And they asked him his thoughts, and he says, "I'll always remember this as the night that Michael and I combined for 70 points." I like the way King looks at life. A great way to compare with really one of the greatest basketball players of all time, in my opinion. Yet John Elliott, in his book, Overachievement, claims that Jordan really wasn't that talented of a basketball player. Listen to these statistics. Jordan only ranked 9th in field goals made. He ranked only 18th in total points scored. He never ranked first in any NBA category. In his prime, he was not the fastest. He was not the most accurate shooter. He was not a great rebounder, and he was not great at defense. Yet he is considered the greatest basketball player of all time. Now, how did a poor defender and kind of an average shooter become a 5-time NBA MVP? Was it passion, confidence, determination? Yeah, I would say it's all of those. But Jordan, who was one time cut from his middle school basketball team, just simply set out to be the best he could possibly be. As Paulie Harvey used to say, we now know the rest of the story. You know, his story, and others like it, we kind of gravitate to. There's something in us about the great achievement of athletes or the pioneer or the successful entrepreneur that kind of speaks to our human spirit. We long to be like them, or at least we look up to their achievements. President John F. Kennedy tells a story about his hero. His hero was his grandfather, Fitzgerald. And Kennedy loved to hear stories about his grandfather growing up in his boyhood home of Ireland. And his grandfather used to tell these stories about how they would walk home from school with their friends, and they would challenge each other. And oftentimes they would challenge each other to climb over this rock wall. Well, this rock wall was tall, it was steep, it had jagged rocks on it, and the boys didn't always want to climb over the rock wall. Well, as some boys would often do, they were wearing their school uniform, and a Catholic school uniform required a hat. And so some of these boys would actually take the hats off these boys, and they would throw it over the wall, and they knew that they couldn't go to school the next day without their hats. So they challenged them to take the risk. They motivated them to climb up over the wall to get their hat. You know, there's a time in all of us when we must toss our hat over the wall. A time to hunger for what I would like to call is really the heroic. Whether it is to change jobs or to strike out onto your own business or maybe go back to school, there comes a time when we feel the need for a dramatic, risk-taking change in our life. Now, I think change is good, especially if it's on an individual basis. I did this a few years back. I changed careers. I went back to school, bought a house. You know the rest of the story. It was a risk. We threw our hat over the wall. But what if that change is for an institution? Let's take a step back. What if that change is for an entire nation? Today, we are going to learn that the nation of Israel makes a huge risk. They literally kind of throw their hat over the wall because they're changing the whole way they operate. So Becky's going to read us a passage out of 1 Samuel about the things that take place with Israel.
Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us, then, a king to govern us, like other nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people and all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, just as they have done to me from the day I brought them up out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So also they are doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice only. You shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, but we are determined to have a king over us, so that we may also be like other nations, and that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles."
Thank you, Becky. This summer, we're having some fun. We're talking about faith and the patriarchs. And today it's a message that really changes things for Israel. You see, up until this passage, Israel did not have a king. As I illustrated with the kids here this morning, Israel had what was called judges. Now, a judge is not like what we think about today, the black-robed judge that sits at a bench. A judge was someone that was appointed by God, that ruled by a sense of wisdom, and that they would often lead people to war. And then when their time was up, when it was time to retire, they would go away and God would help the people find another judge to lead the nation of Israel. And it was not part of their family. But today, Israel is taking a risk. They want to be like other nations. And they're warned, okay, if you go your own way, this is what life is going to be like for the people of Israel. Essentially, Israel is saying, okay, they're throwing their hats over the wall. There's a story that takes place in the early 1900s. Charles Lindbergh decided to fly solo over the Atlantic. He tells that as he was flying over Newfoundland and looking out over the land, and he was thinking, okay, if I have an emergency, I can land my plane in that clearing there, or I can land just beyond that grove of trees there, or I can land my plane on that plateau there. But when he realized he got over the ocean, there was no place to land. And at that point, he literally had to throw his hat over the wall. Or take the story of James Freeman. He was touring Salt Lake City, and he had a guide with him who was Mormon, and she was telling him the story of her grandmother, who had pushed a handcart on foot along the Mormon Trail. As he says, imagine that, pushing a handcart on foot from Omaha through Scottsbluff County. Okay, I added that part. But through the mountains and the deserts, all the way to Utah, believing that your heroes of the faith are waiting for you. As he says, she was literally throwing her hat over the wall. These are people that have blazed a new path. They have succeeded. And we applaud them because it's after the fact. We say, yes, we knew you would do a great job because we read about it in the history books. Essentially, we're saying, yeah, I knew throwing that hat over the wall was a good idea. In fact, Jonas Salk, actually, it's a phrase called the Salk theory. As you might imagine, the person who discovered the Salk, or the vaccine against polio, faced a lot of critics. And one time he made an observation about the critics that was talking about his medical research. And he said in a book, first, people will tell you that you are wrong. Then they will tell you that you are right, but what you're doing really isn't important. Finally, they will admit that you were right and that what you were doing is very important, but after all, they knew it all the time. You know, no one has ever accomplished anything of note without some criticism. Toss your cap over the wall, and you truly find out who your true friends are. There's a story about Winston Churchill, a famous battle that he often would take on a woman by the name of Lady Nancy Astor. Winston Churchill was the hero of Britain during World War II, but he faced a lot of political criticism. In fact, after the war was over, he lost the election as prime minister. Well, one time they were at a state dinner, and as Winston Churchill was talking about his political beliefs and what England needed to do next, Lady Nancy Astor finally stood up. She'd had enough, and she says, "Winston, if you were my husband, I would flavor your coffee with poison." And Churchill said, "Madam, if I was your husband, I would gladly drink it." You know, no one accomplishes anything of note without critics. Reminds me of the story of a guy who took a risk. He threw his hat over the wall, so to speak. And he sought a change in his life. He was about 30 years old at the time. He had a successful business that he inherited from his dad. He was well liked by his friends and neighbors. I mean, things were going well for his life. But he knew this is not where he belonged. He felt called to a ministry of teaching and preaching and healing. And so he threw his cap over the wall. Now, at first, he met with spectacular success. His reputation spread with amazing speed. But as his popularity increased, so did the critics, especially in his hometown. And some of his closest friends said, "You are acting insanely. You need to stop it." And they tried to dissuade him. And his family was concerned about him. But he persevered in his new calling, at least for 3 years. And he died an early death. And then he hung there on a tree between two thieves, dying a cruel and unjust death, feeling forsaken by both God and human being, and I don't think anyone would judge him as a success. But it was. It was the most successful life ever lived. For all this took place in Nazareth some 3,000 or 2,000 years ago. Jesus tossed his cap over the wall. He took a big risk. And this life of adventure is what we now see. Taking a risk. Throwing your hat over the wall. We're going to watch a video now that is in honor of Mary and her anniversary. Yes, it is. This is for Mary. But let's watch this video here of a person that is taking a big risk.
What are you doing here?
You can take a couple of weeks off. Your grandfather saved all of his life to bring the family to this country. He got a good job in the stockyards. He had a nice little house in South Chicago. I was about 12. Somebody sold him on the idea he ought to move to the country and become a dairy farmer. But he buys some land, gets a couple hundred cows. Within 5 months, every one of those cows was dead with disease. There was the depression. Couldn't sell the land. There's no work. So one day, he took off. Didn't come back. My brothers and me, we split up to live with friends and relatives. Chasing a stupid dream causes nothing but you and everyone around you heartache. Notre Dame is for rich kids, smart kids, great athletes. It's not for us. You're a Rudiger. There's nothing in the world wrong with being a Rudiger. You can have a nice life. Frank is going to take over plan number 2. In a couple of years. You make more than me and Johnny. You know he's in charge of the expansion program.
I don't want to be Frank, John.
If you want to know the rest of the story, just ask Mary, right? You know, when the movie Rudy came out, every boy in Nebraska was watching that movie thinking, you know, I'm too slow and I'm too short, but I've got heart, I've got desire, I want to throw my hat over the walls of Memorial Stadium. You know, it takes a risk to throw one's hat over the wall. But it takes faith to make that climb. It takes faith to take on one of your critics. It takes faith to follow your dream. It takes faith to go your own way. Recently, I read a passage in Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Life, or Purpose-Driven Church. And he talks about this idea of faithfulness and going on your own way. Listen to what he says. Faithfulness is accomplishing as much as possible with the resources and talents God has given you. That's why comparing churches is an illegitimate way to measure success. Success is not being larger than some other church. It is bearing as much fruit as possible, given your gifts, opportunities, and potential. Christ doesn't expect us to produce more than we can, but he does expect us to produce all that we can by the power within us. That is a lot more than most of us think is possible. We expect too little from God, and we attempt too little for him. If you're not taking any risks in your ministry, then it is not requiring that you have faith. And if your ministry doesn't require any faith, then you are being unfaithful. How do you define faithfulness? Are you being faithful to God's word if you insist on communicating in an outdated style? Are you being faithful if you insist on doing ministry in a way that is comfortable for you, even though it doesn't produce any fruit? Are you being faithful to Christ if you value human-made traditions more than reaching people for God? I contend that when a church continues to use methods that no longer work, it is being unfaithful to Christ. Now that's throwing your hat over the wall. That's taking a risk. That's running into criticism and opposition. And you know, when Rick Warren started his Saddleback Community Church in Orange County, California, he was told, that church is too edgy. That church is too different. That church is too out of the mainstream to survive. But he stuck to his message to provide a purpose-driven ministry. And we know the rest of the story. The Israelites really, really, really wanted a king. And they begged Samuel, they begged God to be like the other nations, and they are willing to take a risk for it. And then God laid it out, okay, this is what's going to happen if you do. And the people of Israel said, okay, we're ready to go our own way. You know, faith is a lot like that of tossing your hat over the wall, or striking out into a new adventure, or taking on your biggest critic. Because there will always be those who will doubt that your dream will work. And someday, and sometimes your children even pick up on it. It's like the story told about a first grade teacher that had taken her class on a field trip to the zoo. And each of the kids were asked to name an animal. And so one kid pointed out the camel, and another kid pointed out the lion, another kid pointed out the giraffe, and another kid pointed out the bear, another kid pointed out the elephant. And then they got to little Johnny, and Johnny just was really struggling to come up with the name for a deer. And so the teacher kind of prodded him and says, okay, now Johnny, what does your mommy call your daddy at home? And the little boy stood up and says, so that's what a baboon looks like. Now, I don't want to know if any of your spouses ever called you a baboon, but I can assure you that if you're seeking a dramatic change in your life, you're going to encounter some criticism, some tension, and yes, even from your own family. Jesus faced it within his family, even in his own hometown. And in the time of the patriarchs, Israel was facing a crisis. They were attempting to take things in their own direction, and they were facing a lot of criticism. Now, here's some advice for you about anyone that's facing some criticism, or at least how to answer some criticism. Do what the builder of the Panama Canal did. As you might imagine, the Panama Canal was facing a lot of criticism, both in Panama and in Europe, where they tried and failed, and in the United States, and even among its own workers. And one of the employees finally came up to this great engineer, and they asked the builder of the canal, why do you never answer your critics? And this great engineer says, in time, I will, when the canal is finished. You know, there comes a time when we must toss our caps over the wall in spite of what the critics say. Nothing has ever been accomplished by people who value comfort and safety and acceptance above all else. There comes a time when we've got to take that leap of faith. And of course, go on the greatest adventure of all time. The most spectacular, the most courageous of adventures. And that's take a leap of faith. Now, unfortunately, some of you might not understand this message. Because when it comes to discipleship, we sometimes confuse discipleship with church membership. We sometimes confuse discipleship with respectability. But certainly there is no risk involved in being respectable or being part of a church. But becoming a disciple of Jesus Christ is to move from a nominal belief to a radical conviction. Is to move from a nodding acceptance to God to a complete commitment of God's work. That's more of a challenge than digging a canal, than finding a cure for polio, or being the best basketball player ever. I one time read of the conversion story of a singer by the name of Paul Stokey. Does anybody know who that is? Some of you are probably familiar with a song that he wrote called The Wedding Song. Let me play it for you here. Heads nodding. You recognize the song. You recognize it. You're probably thinking of a wedding that you attended. Now, I've been humming that song all week when I came across this story. And you're welcome for not singing it to you, so thank you. But many of you, if you're not familiar with who Paul Stokey is, he is the second part of the trio of Peter, Paul, and Mary. One time, Paul Stokey was having a difficult time. He was searching around. He was feeling unfulfilled. And so he sought the advice of a good friend of his by the name of Bob Dylan about what to do. And Paul Stokey says that he got two pieces of really good advice from Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan told him, one, go take a walk in the country. And two, read your Bible. Yes, Bob Dylan told him to read his Bible. And Paul Stokey said that's what he did. He went out and he walked out in the countryside, and it was amazing. He put his priorities back in order, and then he opened up the Bible and began to read it. Now, Peter and Paul and Mary, it's kind of interesting because they sing a lot of gospel tunes, a lot of spirituals, but they never once opened the Bible. It was difficult at first. He read passages he didn't completely understand, but his heart began to change. Something real happened to him, and to this day, Paul Stokey is still alive at 80 years old, is today a true disciple of Jesus Christ. One could say that he threw his hat over the wall and made a big risk, and it paid off. You know, when I think of the faith walk that we have, I think of something that my wife often talks about. She teaches a class called Circle of Security, and the message is pretty basic. And it goes like this. Children begin life from a secure base with their parents. And then a child begins to explore. As the child begins to explore, they are curious. But they still need to be watched over when they explore. The security of knowing that they have their parent to return to allows them to explore farther and farther and farther away each time. If the parent allows the child to go out and explore and welcome them with open arms, children will feel secure enough to come back out and explore again. The Israelites are exploring. They have thrown their hat over the wall, but they know that God is the secure base that they're exploring from. They come back time and time again. Even though God warned them, okay, this is the way it's going to be when you go on out, the Israelites, they came back, and God welcomed them with open arms. Our faith walk is like that. We go out, we take a leap of faith, we explore, we're trying to figure things out, we throw that hat over the wall, we take a big risk, but we rest safe and secure in knowing that God is always that secure base. Go your own way, but always come back to God. Amen. And it's time to end. When I see this many fans, it means it's time to go. Let us, we ask our ushers to wait.